curious, I think I've read interviews where you have tried to separate your approach in science to your approach in politics, but I'm curious as to whether, I'll ask the question again, is there, let me ask you this way, how does your approach to the world as a scientist affect and influence the way you approach politics?
Well, and sort of, see, I think studying science is a good way to get into fields like history.
Okay.
The reason is you learn what an argument means. Mm-hmm. You learn what evidence is. You learn, what makes sense to postulate and when. What's going to be convincing. You sort of internalize the modes of rational inquiry, which happen to be much more advanced in the sciences than anywhere else. On the other hand, applying relativity theory to history isn't going to get you anywhere.
No.
So it's a mode of thinking,
okay.
And I try, at least with what success others have to judge, to use the mode of thinking that you would use in the sciences to human affairs. And I think it's a good idea to do so. As to other connections, there may be some, but they're pretty remote. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about the core notions of what I was calling anarchism, which, as I say, is just deeply rooted in popular traditions everywhere, for good reasons, I think. It's based on a certain conception of, if you sort of try to take it apart, it's based on some kind of conception of what Bakunin once called an instinct for freedom.
Mm-hmm.
People have an instinctive drive for freedom from domination and control. I think can't prove it, but mm-hmm. It's probably true. The core of the work that I've been interested in language is also interested in a kind of human freedom, the cognitive capacity to create indefinitely and its roots in our nature. Now, historically, people have drawn a connection between this. So if you look at the, say, 18th century Enlightenment and the Romantic period, this connection was explicitly drawn. Mm-hmm. So you read Rousseau or Wilhelm von Humboldt and others, the connection between human freedom in the social and political realm and human freedom in the creative use of cognitive capacities, particularly language. They did try to establish a connection. Now, if you ask, can this be connected at the level of science, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. It's just a sort of a parallel intuition, which doesn't link up empirically, but maybe could someday if we knew enough.
You said somewhere, I think in this new book on power, you can lie or distort the story of the French Revolution as long as you like and nothing will happen. Propose a false theory in chemistry and it'll be refuted tomorrow.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing I mean. Yeah. Nature is tough. Can't fiddle with Mother Nature. She's a hard taskmistress. So you're forced to be honest mm-hmm. in the natural sciences. In the soft fields, you're not forced to be honest. Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to undermine. I mean, there are standards, of course. On the other hand, they're very weak. And if what you propose is ideologically acceptable, that is supportive of power systems, you can get away with a huge amount. Mm-hmm. In fact, the difference between the conditions that are imposed on dissident opinion and on mainstream opinion are radically different. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll give you concrete examples mm-hmm. if you like.
Yeah, do.
Okay, so for example, if I write about terrorism, say I've written about terrorism, and I think you can show without much difficulty that terrorism pretty much corresponds to power. I don't think that's very surprising. Mm-hmm. But the more powerful states are involved in more terrorism mm-hmm. by and large, and the United States is the most powerful, so it's involved in massive terrorism by its own definition of terrorism. Well, if I want to establish that, I'm required to give a huge amount of evidence, and I think that's a good thing. I don't object to that. I think anyone who makes that claim should be held to very high standards. So extensive documentation from the internal secret record, from the historical record, and so on. Mm-hmm. And if you ever find a comma misplaced, somebody ought to criticize you for it. Mm-hmm. So I think those standards are fine. All right, now let's suppose that you play the mainstream game. So, for example, Yale University Press just came out with a volume called The Age of Terror. The contributors are leading historians, many of them at Yale, the top people in the field. You read the book, The Age of Terror, first thing you notice is there isn't a single footnote. There isn't a single reference. They're just off the top of your head statements. Some of the statements are tenable, some are untenable, but there are no criteria. There are no intellectual criteria imposed. The reviews of the book are very favorable and laudatory, because, and maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. I mean, I happen to think a lot of it's wrong and demonstrably wrong, but it doesn't really matter. You can say anything you want because you're supporting power, and nobody expects you to justify anything. For example, if I was, say, on the unimaginable circumstance that I was on some, say, Nightline, and I was asked to say, do you think Gaddafi is a terrorist? I could say, yeah, Gaddafi's a terrorist. I don't need any evidence. Suppose I said George Bush is a terrorist. Well, then I would be expected to provide evidence. No, you can't just say that.
So you aren't cut off right there.
And in fact, the structure of the news production system is you can't produce evidence. In fact, there's even a name for it. I learned it from the producer of Nightline, Jeff Greenfield. It's called concision. He was asked in an interview somewhere why they didn't have me on Nightline, and his answer was two answers. First of all, he says, well, he talks Turkish, nobody understands it. But the other answer was he lacks concision, which is correct. I agree with him. The kinds of things that I would say on Nightline you can't say in one sentence because they depart from standard religion. If you want to repeat the religion, you can get away with it between two commercials. If you want to say something that questions the religion, you're expected to give evidence. And that you can't do it between two commercials. So therefore you lack concision, so therefore you can't talk. Actually, that's a terrific technique of propaganda. To impose concision is a way of virtually guaranteeing that the party line gets repeated over and over again and that nothing else is heard.